Dinner was supposed to be peaceful that evening in Lagos. The whole family was gathered around the wooden table, bowls of steaming jollof rice and fried plantain in front of them. Chinedu, just 24, was glad to be home after a long day of trying to grow his small business. He didn't expect anything unusual until his father, Obinna, suddenly cleared his throat and dropped a bombshell. "Chinedu," he said firmly, "you will pay for your sister Ngozi's wedding. It must be the biggest our family has ever seen." The words hung heavy in the air. Everyone stopped eating. Ngozi's eyes lit up, already picturing the glamorous celebration. Their mother glanced at Chinedu nervously, knowing the weight of the demand. But Chinedu stayed calm. He respected his father, but he knew this wasn't something he could accept. "Papa," he said softly, "I can't do that right now. I'm just starting my own business. I don't have the money to fund such a wedding." The silence that followed was painful. Obinna's face darkened, his pride wounded. To him, a son refusing his father was unthinkable. The room grew tense, as if even the walls were listening. Chinedu felt his heart race, but he kept his voice steady. Obinna slammed his hand on the table, anger burning in his eye. The meal was forgotten, replaced with fury and disappointment. In that single moment, the family dinner turned into a battlefield, and Chinedu realized nothing would ever be the same again. From the outside, people thought Chinedu was the lucky one in the family, the son who always had money in his pocket, the one who could solve every problem. But the truth was very different. For as long as he could remember, he had been treated like the family's personal ATM. Anytime there was a crisis, all eyes turned to him. When Ngozi needed new school uniforms, Obinna would say, "Chinedu, bring the money." If the electricity bill was overdue, it was, "Chinedu, handle it." Even when his father's friends came around asking for repayment of loans Obinna had borrowed, the burden somehow ended up on Chinedu's shoulders. He was barely in his 20s, yet he carried responsibilities that even grown men twice his age would struggle with. It wasn't that he didn't love his family, he did. In fact, he gave so much because he wanted to keep peace in the house. But each time he handed over money, he felt a little piece of himself shrinking. His dreams were always pushed to the side so that someone else could shine. What made it worse was the way Ngozi was treated. She was pampered like royalty. If she asked for a new phone, she got it. If she wanted to attend a fancy event, her parents would make sure she had the best outfit. Chinedu noticed the difference, but he swallowed his feelings, keeping quiet as everyone praised her while ignoring his sacrifices. The years of imbalance built up quietly. He would lie awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering why his worth in the family was measured only by what he could give. He longed for someone to ask about his struggles, his business, his future. But those questions never came. To them, he was dependable only because of his wallet. So when his father demanded he pay for Ngozi's extravagant wedding, Chinedu's refusal wasn't rebellion. It was survival. He knew if he said yes again, his life would no longer belong to him. He would forever be trapped in a cycle of giving until he had nothing left. Saying no was his way of protecting his future, his dreams, and even his sanity. Deep down, the years of being the ATM's son had already hardened him. He still loved his family, but he also knew love should not feel like slavery. Every memory of paying school fees, clearing household debts, or bailing his father out replayed in his mind that night at dinner. For the first time, he chose himself. And that choice, though painful, was the spark that would change everything in his life. The moment Chinedu's quiet refusal left his lips, the entire table froze. You could almost hear the sound of the ceiling fan above them. Obinna's face turned red, his eyes blazing with anger. For a man whose word had always been law in the family, hearing no from his own son was like an insult he could not swallow. He slammed his fist against the table so hard the plates rattled. "If you won't fund your sister's wedding, you're no son of mine." His voice carried through the open windows, spilling into the street for neighbors to hear. The words cut through Chinedu like a knife. He had expected disappointment, maybe even a lecture, but never this, never being disowned in front of his whole family. Ngozi gasped, her spoon clattering against the plate. Their mother reached out to calm Obinna, but he pushed her hand away. "Pack your bags tonight. Leave this house. A useless son has no place here." Chinedu sat frozen for a moment, his chest tight. He wanted to argue, to explain himself again, but what was the point? His father wasn't listening. Slowly, he stood up, forcing himself to stay composed even though inside he felt like a child again, small and powerless. He walked to his room and began folding his clothes into a small suitcase. The laptop, his most precious possession, went carefully into its bag. That device carried his entire future, though no one in the house knew it. As he zipped up the suitcase, his mother appeared at the door, tears streaming down her face. "My son," she whispered, "please just say yes. Your father will calm down." But Chinedu shook his head gently. "Mama, if I say yes, I'll lose myself forever." Minutes later, he stepped out of the house, suitcase in one hand, laptop bag slung over his shoulder. His heart felt heavy, each step slower than the last. The night air was cool, but shame burned hot across his face. Neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by Obina's shouting. They watched in silence, whispering behind their hands as Chinedu walked past. "Imagine," someone murmured, "a son refusing to pay for his own sister's wedding." Another scoffed. "And now he's been chased out. What a disgrace." Chinedu kept his eyes on the ground, refusing to meet their stares. Every whisper was like a stone thrown at his back, but he carried on. With nothing but a small suitcase and his laptop, he left behind not just his father's house, but years of silent sacrifice that had gone unnoticed. As the gate shut behind him, he felt both broken and strangely free. Heartbroken, yes, but deep inside, a quiet voice reminded him that this was not the end. It was only the painful beginning of something greater. As Chinedu walked out of his father's compound that night, carrying only his suitcase and laptop, everyone thought he was finished. To the neighbors, he looked like a disgraced young man with nowhere to go. Even Obina believed he had chased away a failure who couldn't meet a simple family duty. But the truth was very different. Chinedu wasn't broke. In fact, he was standing on the edge of a life-changing breakthrough. For the past 2 years, he had been building something quietly in Abuja, a fintech startup that was beginning to shake the market. He and 2 close friends had spent countless sleepless nights coding, pitching, and meeting with potential partners. Their dream was to create a financial platform that made transactions easier for ordinary Nigerians, especially small businesses who struggled with traditional banking. Already, the startup had attracted the attention of international investors. A South African firm had shown interest, and even some European venture capitalists were calling. Money hadn't poured in yet, but deals were on the table, contracts were being drafted, and the future looked brighter than anyone at that dinner table could imagine. Chinedu had kept all of this a secret from his family. He wasn't trying to be mysterious, he was protecting himself. He knew if his father discovered he had access to money, every naira would be demanded for household bills, debts, or Ngozi's endless luxury. His hard work would vanish into the same black hole of family expectations that had already swallowed years of his earnings. That's why his laptop was so precious. To others, it looked like just another device, but to him, it was the heartbeat of his company. It held the codes, the pitch decks, the business plans, and the signed agreements. Without it, the startup would crumble. With it, he carried the key to millions. The irony was painful. While his father was humiliating him for refusing to pay for a wedding, investors abroad were praising his vision and commitment. While neighbors gossiped that he was selfish, professionals in boardrooms were calling him brilliant. No one at home knew that Chinedu was about to become the kind of man Obina had always bragged about, successful, respected, and wealthy. But Chinedu wasn't chasing wealth just to prove a point. Deep inside, he wanted freedom. He wanted to break the cycle of being the ATM son and finally live on his own terms. He wanted to build something that lasted, something bigger than family demands and endless sacrifice. As he settled that night in a friend's apartment in Abuja, opening his laptop to join a late-night Zoom call with investors, he smiled faintly. They saw him not as a wallet, but as a leader. The world was about to discover the Chinedu his father never took the time to see. And soon, the same laptop Obina dismissed would rewrite the family's story forever. The weeks after Chinedu walked out were filled with noise in the family compound. Ngozi's wedding preparations took over everything. Tents were booked, asoebi fabrics were ordered, and caterers promised mountains of food. The sound of generators hummed late into the night as tailors sewed and decorators measured. Obina moved around with pride, chest out, as though nothing had happened. What people didn't know was that much of this big wedding was being fueled by loans he had quietly collected from banks and friends. Relatives whispered behind closed doors. "How can Chinedu refuse to support his sister?" one auntie said. "He is so selfish. After all his father has done for him, he can't even contribute." Others nodded in agreement, shaking their heads as if they had uncovered a great shame. Nobody remembered the years Chinedu had already carried the family on his back. It was easier to brand him the ungrateful son. Chinedu heard the gossip. Messages reached him from cousins and old neighbors. Some mocked, some scolded, some even begged him to change his mind and show up with money. But he stayed silent. He didn't defend himself, he didn't explain, and he didn't bother correcting the lies. His energy was focused somewhere else, on his laptop, on his partners, and on the company that was slowly rising like the morning sun. Every day, he worked late with his team in Abuja. While his family danced around wedding plans, he was in boardrooms pitching to investors. While his father boasted about how his son was useless, Chinedu was finalizing contracts that promised millions in funding. The contrast was almost poetic. One man drowning himself in debt for a single day of glamour, while the other built a business designed to last generations. At night, when the house grew quiet, Chinedu sometimes thought of his mother. He imagined her in the kitchen, trying to hold the family together, hiding her sadness behind forced smile. He felt guilty for leaving her behind in the storm, but he also knew he had no choice. If he had stayed, he would have been crushed. The invitations went out, and the wedding buzz grew louder. People mocked Chinedu openly now. What kind of brother abandons his sister on her big day, they said. Still, he said nothing. He had learned that silence was sometimes the strongest answer. His focus was unshakable, because deep inside, he knew time was working in his favor. Every contract signed, every deal sealed, was a step closer to a truth his family and neighbors could not yet see. They laughed now, but soon they would realize the boy they dismissed as selfish was the one quietly building a future powerful enough to turn their world upside down. For now, he let them celebrate. His reply would come later, and it would be louder than any gossip. The night before Ngozi's wedding, the family compound was alive with music and chatter. Relatives had traveled from near and far, filling every room and spilling into the courtyard. Pots of soup bubbled over open fires, and crates of beer stood stacked in the corner. In the middle of it all was Obinna, moving from table to table, his voice booming above the laughter. With a bottle of palm wine in hand, he bragged loudly about how strong his family was. "Who needs Chinedu?" he shouted, waving his hand as though brushing dust off his shoulder. "That boy is a failure. He thinks he's smart, but he will come back begging one day. Watch and see." The crowd laughed with him, eager to stay on his good side. Some clapped, others joined in mocking Chinedu, calling him arrogant and ungrateful. Obinna soaked it all in, drunk on both the wine and the attention. Meanwhile, in Abuja, Chinedu sat in a quiet apartment, his laptop open, eyes fixed on the screen. He wasn't at a party. He was in a meeting that would change his life. His startup had been negotiating with a major South African bank for months, and tonight, after endless calls and revisions, the deal was finally ready. He and his partners signed the exclusive partnership agreement just before midnight. The moment was surreal. This wasn't just money, it was validation. Their company was now officially in business with one of the biggest banks on the continent. But the deal carried another ripple effect that no one in Lagos expected. Because Obinna had years earlier used Chinedu's name and small business accounts as collateral for his loans without ever fully clearing them, the new partnership triggered an automatic audit and freeze on connected accounts. Suddenly, every debt tied to Obinna came to light, and the bank swooped in to lock his assets. While Obinna was raising his cup, boasting that he didn't need his son, his bank accounts were already frozen. The credit cards he planned to swipe the next morning for last-minute wedding expenses were useless. The cash he promised vendors was gone. The man who had called Chinedu a failure was unknowingly walking into his own public embarrassment. Back in Abuja, Chinedu closed his laptop, leaned back in his chair, and let out a deep breath. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from his partners and investors, but he didn't smile widely or shout with joy. Instead, he sat quietly, thinking about the irony of it all. He hadn't planned to bring his father down. He only wanted freedom. But fate had a way of balancing the scales. As drums beat and laughter echoed through his family compound that night, two very different realities played out. One man celebrated, blind to the storm about to hit. The other prepared for the dawn of a new chapter, calm and steady, knowing that tomorrow would reveal the truth to everyone. The morning of the wedding was supposed to be the proudest day of Obinna's life. The hotel hall had been decorated with bright flowers, golden chairs, and a stage fit for royalty. Guests arrived in their finest lace and agbada, the air buzzing with excitement. Ngozi, glowing in her bridal robe, posed for photos as makeup artists fluttered around her. Everything looked perfect, at least on the surface. But perfection began to crack when Obinna walked up to the hotel front desk to settle a bill. He slid his card with confidence, already imagining the admiration of guests once the ceremony began. A second later, the receptionist frowned. "Sir, your card has been declined. Do you have another one?" Obinna chuckled awkwardly and handed over a different card. Again, declined. He tried a third, sweat starting to form on his forehead. Declined. His voice rose as he demanded the staff try again. But no matter the card, the response was the same. Transaction failed. Word spread quickly, as it always does. A guest at the desk whispered to another, and soon the whispers turned into waves across the hall. "Obinna's accounts are frozen," someone said. "He can't pay." The same relatives who had laughed with him the night before now began shaking their heads, whispering in corners. Meanwhile, the caterers were already lining up. "Sir, we need our balance before we serve the food," they said firmly. The band, still unpacking their instruments, refused to play without payment. Even the decorator threatened to remove the flowers if he didn't get his money immediately. The grand wedding began to crumble like a cake left in the rain. Ngozi, still in her robe, sensed the tension. She stepped out, confusion written on her face. "Papa, what's happening?" she asked. Obinna tried to wave her back inside, forcing a smile, but his trembling hands betrayed him. His pride, which had carried him so far, was now drowning him in front of the very people he wanted to impress. Guests began to murmur louder. Some smirked, enjoying the drama. Others pitied Ngozi, whose dream wedding was dissolving before her eyes. A few even whispered about Chinedu, remembering the fight weeks earlier. Maybe the boy wasn't so wrong, someone said. Maybe he knew this would happen. By mid-morning, chaos had taken over. The caterers packed up their pots, the band carried their drums back to the van, and the hotel staff demanded immediate settlement, or they would shut down the hall. The glamorous wedding Obinna had promised was slipping through his fingers. He stood in the center of the hall, frozen, as if the walls were closing in. For the first time, he had no answers, no money, and no son to bail him out. All the pride and bragging from the night before now hung over him like a curse. The celebration that was meant to showcase the family's wealth had turned into a public humiliation, and it was only the beginning. The hotel hall was in chaos. Caterers had stopped serving. The band was carrying their equipment back to the van, and relatives were buzzing like flies around a wound. Obinna's face was pale as he argued with the hotel manager, waving his hands helplessly. Ngozi sat in a corner, close to tears, her makeup smudging as she begged her father to fix things. The grand wedding was falling apart in full view of everyone. Then the doors swung open. Heads turned at once. In walked Chinedu. He wasn't the broken son neighbors had gossiped about. He wasn't wearing torn clothes or carrying a shabby bag. Instead, he wore a dark tailored suit that fit him perfectly, his steps steady, his expression calm. The entire hall froze for a moment, stunned into silence. Behind him followed two sharply dressed men and a woman, all with accents that marked them as foreigners, investors from Cape Town who had flown in with him. Their presence alone spoke volume. Chinedu didn't need to brag. His appearance had already changed the story. Relatives who had called him selfish only weeks ago now stared wide-eyed, struggling to process the transformation. Whispers rushed through the hall like a wave. "Is that Chinedu?" someone muttered. "Look at him. He's not suffering at all." Another gasped. "Those people with him. Who are they?" "Investors." The same mouths that once mocked him now spoke with awe and confusion. Chinedu walked straight past the gossiping relatives, past the vendors still demanding their money, and into the center of the hall. His presence alone commanded respect. He didn't raise his voice, didn't scowl, didn't show anger. His calmness was sharper than any insult. Obinna turned and froze when he saw his son. For a moment, he seemed to forget the unpaid bills, the frozen accounts, and the shame around him. His pride clashed with fear, and he stood speechless, gripping the back of a chair as though it could hold him up. Ngozi's eyes widened. "Chinedu," she whispered, torn between shock and embarrassment. She had dreamed of a glamorous wedding funded by her brother's money, but she never imagined he would show up like this. Stronger than ever, untouchable. The investors nodded politely to the guests, but it was clear they were here for business, not drama. Their presence was proof that Chinedu had built something bigger than anyone in that room had ever believed possible. The silence stretched until it became almost uncomfortable. Every eye was on him, waiting for him to speak. But Chinedu didn't rush. He adjusted his cufflinks, took a slow look around the hall, and allowed the weight of his appearance to settle in. Without saying a single word, he had already won back the dignity that had been stripped from him. In that moment, everyone knew. The boy they once mocked was no longer the family's ATM son. He was a man on his own path, walking with people who saw his true worth. His success spoke louder than any insult ever thrown at him. The silence in the hall was heavy, every guest waiting to see what would happen next. Chinedu stood tall in his suit, his investors just behind him, while Obinna shifted nervously, still clutching the chair for balance. The proud father who had bragged so loudly the night before now looked smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Chinedu finally broke the silence. His voice was steady, not raised, but it carried across the hall clearly. "Papa," he began, locking eyes with his father, "you called me selfish. You told everyone I abandoned my family. But the truth is, you only ever saw me as a wallet, not as a son." Gasps filled the room. A few relatives dropped their drinks. The words cut deep because they were not said in anger, but in truth. Chinedu continued, his tone calm but firm. "I refused to fund a wedding because I was building something bigger. I chose to invest in my future instead of throwing everything into one day of show. You thought that made me a failure. But look at me now. I stand on my own." He paused, letting his words sink in. The hall was so quiet you could hear the buzz of the ceiling lights. Obinna's lips trembled, but no words came out. For the first time, the man who had always spoken with authority had nothing to say. Chinedu's eyes swept over the relatives who had mocked him. "All of you judged me without knowing my story. You whispered. You called me selfish. You said I was a disgrace. But while you mocked me, I was working day and night to build something that would last. I will never apologize for choosing my future over being used." Obinna staggered back a little, his face pale. He had spent weeks telling anyone who would listen that Chinedu was a disappointment. Now, in front of the same audience, his son was proving otherwise. It was a humiliation far deeper than losing money. It was losing respect. Ngozi covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the stares of the guests. The same people who had been praising her only hours earlier now looked at her family with pity and judgment. Chinedu turned back to his father one last time. His voice dropped lower, almost gentle, but it carried more weight than ever. "Papa, I love you, but I will never be used again. From today, I live on my own terms." The hall erupted in whispers, shock rippling through the crowd. Some clapped quietly, others shook their heads in disbelief. Obinna stood frozen, unable to meet his son's gaze. In that moment, the power shifted completely. Chinedu was no longer the son begging for approval. He was the man who had faced his father, spoken his truth, and walked away with his dignity intact. The entire hall knew it. The story of the ATM son was over. After the chaos of the wedding, Chinedu walked out with his head held high. He didn't need applause or approval. He had already proven to himself what mattered most: his independence and his worth. The whispers and stares of relatives faded behind him as he stepped into a future he had worked tirelessly to create. Weeks later, Chinedu bought a new home in Port Harcourt. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of freedom, a place where he could make his own rules and live on his own terms. His fintech startup continued to grow, attracting more investors and partnerships. The company was now valued in the millions, a reality that turned the skeptics' whispers into stunned silence. Obinna, humbled by the events and the public exposure of his mistakes, eventually reached out. He asked for forgiveness, recognizing for the first time the years he had treated Chinedu as nothing more than a source of money. But Chinedu had changed. He met his father's apology with calm and respect, but made it clear that he would no longer live under someone else's control. He could forgive, but he would never be trapped again. In his new office, Chinedu sat back in his chair, looking out at the city skyline. The sunlight caught the polished desk and the neatly stacked files of his growing company. A small smile formed on his face, not of arrogance, but of quiet satisfaction. He had earned his success, yes, but more importantly, he had earned his respect. He knew that real respect wasn't given, and it wasn't demanded. It was earned by standing firm, saying no when it mattered, and believing in yourself even when the world doubted you. For Chinedu, this was only the beginning. The boy who had been the ATM son was gone. In his place stood a man who knew his worth, had claimed his freedom, and was ready to shape his own legacy.